So today's topic kind of takes us into an interesting place. When I first wrote this as a design was back in 2012. And actually I used a different platform than PowerPoint, which is a little more expressive. And there was actually some song and dance and some music and some different things in it. And the point that I was making at the time, which of course, as you know, was at the second election for President Obama at that time, at that election. And so there were some materials that I used at that time that were aimed at the tension that was already building in our society. So this sort of builds off of that. I say that as a precursor to, alert you that this topic's not one that we chose simply because we're in an election year, simply because of who's in the election year, or simply because of the increased tension that we've been having. It's something that I largely created back in 2012. Dr. Joe Ellis wrote a book before that called Founding Brothers, which I highly recommend to you if you're not. It's a really short book. It's nice. It's a good one though to make your way through. And his writing was something that I, was always standing on the shoulders of giants in the field of history, and it kind of connected with some things that I had been seeing at a time when I was writing my book that's connected to Strauss and Howe's work on the idea of the cycle of American history, of the Anglo-American, roughly 80 years, always leading to crisis, which is, if you read their book, of course, but if you read my little book, you'd realize there are clues for that crisis, and we've hit all the clues. So in any case, we hadn't in 2012, and I finished my book in 2011, and so having worked on that, having read Joe's book, and thought this is something I really want to start highlighting for my students, just because it is obviously the history that we have, but then for other audiences to help them understand that perhaps what they are sensing is not unique to our time. So that's kind of where we're going to go. So let me dive in. Some of this you may have seen before. Some of you who've been here before, he's going to mention Locke and Hobbes. So we're going to get back to that just because it's so vital to stress that. And again, as a citizen civics point of view, my hope is that you walk out of here with a little bit of a sense of a deeper understanding of the system the Americans set up. And so to that point, if you don't know Locke and Hobbes, you don't know our system. So let's kind of walk through that. So here's the story, unfortunately, we tell our children. And the story is this. In 1776, some brilliant leaders got together, wrote an amazing document that people wanted to copy. We had to do that and had to fight a little war because evil England had shown up and was trying to take over our country out of nowhere. We, of course, won that war because we're virtuous and righteous. We took a little break, a little rest. Then we wrote a government because we thought that'd be a nice idea. And then everybody went home happy. And the end. Until, of course, those evil slave racist people in the South did some stupid stuff and we had to fight a civil war. But till then, everybody was cool. No, all that's a myth. In fact, every one of those are incorrect at one level. And we've covered some of those. So what we want to look at then is, well, what does it mean to say the Founding Brothers, to use Ellis's phrase, divided? What did it mean that there was tension that emerged among them? These paintings we like because they suggest to us something that we would wish to be true. In fact, I was trying to research this before the talk. I'll just say, in my memory, since the 2000 election, nearly all, I want to say all, but nearly all the candidates who've run, including the men who won the presidential election and some of the governor elections for our state, emphasized, vote for me, I'm a uniter. Right? Now, it's not that President Clinton, George Herbert Walker Bush, or Reagan didn't think in those terms, President Carter, President Ford, but because of where we were in the cycle, it wasn't as clearly seen as, oh, wow, we're divided. So I stress that to you again, if for no other reason than to remind you what we're in now, this is not our first rodeo. And to even further recognize when you look back at the time of Washington and Adams. So many people, were you to say, well, it's really bad now, don't you wish somebody else was leading, or don't you wish you were in a time when someone else was leading, they would often go straight to Washington's time as an example of great leadership and everybody loved each other. And we just want to disabuse you of that. One reason I want to disabuse people of that fact is because, for myself at least, I find when I lose my illusions I'm in a better position to make critical decisions. One of my mentors taught me that when I was moaning about some stuff in my life some years ago. And he said, you sound disillusioned. I'm like, I am disillusioned. He goes, well, that's good. And I'm like, what? And then he brought it out for me in just in English. To be disillusioned means to lose the illusion. And so then you're in a place where you can make better decisions. And that was about stuff for my personal life. But I think it's true for our corporate life and our civic life and our life as business leaders as well. And I would offer, and we'll see if we get there at the end. I might show you one more slide at the very, very end. We'll see how it goes. In which perhaps the lesson we take away is that when we think about government of the people, which is what we are, the system we are a part of, a key secret ingredient, your Kung Fu Panda, right? The secret ingredient is perhaps that we exist in a constant state of tension and division. And that might, maybe, alert us to the potential that if someone is running for office saying, I can unite us, that's worrisome. That's perhaps the person not to vote for. Which means you're going to be like me, often figuring out, I don't know who to vote for because they all said that. That's a different conversation, and you don't have to agree with that, and I might not be able to prove that case, nor that might not be the correct outcome, but it's one that I think about often. So let me see if I can show it to you, all right? So that's my job here is to kind of prove it to you. So let's go all the way back to the beginning. In the beginning of the country, this tension is constantly seen. And you can see that when you look at the various colonies that become what we call the United States. And for our purposes, we're going to keep kind of focusing ourselves on the British colonies, though obviously you're aware that we here in Florida, we're here first in St. Augustine and then in Pensacola, and that there's other people, both Canadians, Dutch, Swedes, other people who didn't have colonies, and obviously Spanish, who are part of the mix of what we call the United States. But working chronologically to a thing called the United States, we're talking about the British. That's our focus, right, on the British. And so when you look at those colonies, they're established in a way that is unique and singular, to the point that, as you can see, they often had disdain for the other colonies. There's not a point, including, as I'm going to show you in a second, in 1776, in which the colonists perceived themselves as setting up a united nation. All right, so we get to the word united almost as an aberration from what the original colonists perceived. Now, that's not to say that each of the certain colonies did not perhaps perceive themselves as taking over the whole continent. I always talk about the Virginians in Jamestown, and if you know anybody from Virginia, to them, this should be the United States of Virginia. And the whole colony of what we call the whole region of North America, certainly north of, say, the Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee line working westward, should all just be a gigantic nation of Virginia. But that would mean what they're doing in Philadelphia, what they're doing in Boston, what they're doing in St. Mary's to their east, are not their problem, nor their concern, nor their interest. What they're doing is what they're doing, not what we're doing. When you move your way into the revolution, this same tension or reality still exists. Most people are unaware. And we've covered it here. If you've been here before with me when I've done the revolution, you know this, that there was a significant percentage of people who either opposed the revolution or who were neutral to the revolution. Now, they were neutral, the same reason a lot of people are quote-unquote neutral today, because they're not paying attention, they don't want to be bothered, and they don't necessarily care. And you and I, if you care, you might say to them, well, you'll care later when the bad thing happens. And that may be true, but at the moment you can't convince them to get off of center. But remember, we were rebelling against the most liberal, progressive country in the world. And when you look, as we did before a couple times here, if you go read the latter 2/3 of the Declaration, almost everything that Jefferson writes is incorrect. I mean, it's a false claim relative to saying tyranny. So that's a different conversation, but the point for us is this, that they were opposed. So momentum builds post-massacre, which, again, is not a massacre, but different conversation. But still, you're really only 35, maybe 40%. Now, please understand, for those of you who are skilled historians in the room, we don't have hardcore data relative to like opinion polls. So those don't exist. So when historians give these numbers, they're giving them off of diaries, letters, commentary, feedback, letters to the editors, and they're sort of building their case. All right, so again, we're using these numbers loosely. Well, of course, as you know, Paine writes common sense. One of the key things that makes common sense so important was the fact that he was writing it to the common person. I jokingly say to my students, you know, John Adams and those guys were putting their writings in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. They're going on PBS to talk. Paine was putting his article in the USA Today, and he's talking to Jimmy Kimmel. He's on the Tonight Show. Quick, quippy, funny, everybody's laughing. And in doing so, he built momentum. In January, momentum only to maybe 50% though. So yay, 50%. But then the point we're trying to make, the larger point, 50% of the inhabitants of North America were like, no, why would I want to rebel? I don't have any promise of this thing you're saying is going to be better in my future is actually true. And I know what people live like in other parts of the empire or of Europe, and why would I want that? I mean, we live in an amazing place. Even after word got to the colonies that in essence Parliament declared war on us. So the Prohibitory Act is passed in late 75. We find out about it in early spring 76. And it was the act that the king signed off on that allowed the British Navy to stop and seize any American ship. As that got out, more people got mad. There was a great little quip that John Adams writes to Abigail saying, because she was often writing him complaining, why is this taking so long? And the Bostonians in general, Massachusetts, were thinking we should have already declared our independence and gone for it, because obviously the center of tension at that moment was in Boston after the coercive / intolerable acts. So he's writing her back going, hey, relax, we got to get there. But he's writing her in April saying, hey, good news, as more people are finding out about this, it is actually doing the opposite of what the king might have wanted and Parliament might have wanted. It is pushing more people into our camp. So it's true. And if you follow, in fact, if you go to my website, you can watch the talk I gave here about 1776. You can sort of trace the up and down of opinion, of support, really high in July after the Declaration is passed, falls off by August once the disasters of the battlefield happen, down to single digits by December, and then Washington sort of saves the day. But you can see again in the Revolutionary Room itself, look at this, three colonies voted against the Declaration. Again, the myth, we were all mad at England, we all united and we went after them. Nope. There was rancorous debate about that 30, 40, 30 split. You can see that in Philadelphia. It might have been more 25, 50. There were more people in the room who were pro-revolution, but there was still a significant number of the representatives in Philadelphia in the spring of 76 who were opposed. And they don't want to, because they're either afraid or they're happy where they are. I'm not saying they're right or wrong, we're just trying to point out this issue of division. And this idea of opposition will be a piece of why Washington on the battlefield and Adams and Franklin in the diplomatic office when they've gone off to France are consistently opposed at home. I mean, you can almost trace the entirety of the war as Washington not only fighting the British, but fending off his opponents who are unhappy with him on the battlefield. So even in a moment of war in which you would think, well, everybody clearly would be united for the task at hand. No, they weren't. And Washington more than once almost stepped down. Adams basically does step down, comes back from Paris. Then Congress is like, oh, we didn't really think he'd call our bluff like that. And they sent him back to Paris because he was really like, you're it, you and Franklin, we need you. And Adams was like, well, get off my back then and quit opposing me for the things that I'm trying to do. So that division, again, is the point of our talk today. Now, Once we had won, you then are moving towards our governing system. We've covered this again in depth, and all I want to point out here again is a sense of opposition. This is where we pick up Locke. What are they trying to do? This is vital to understand why perhaps there's so much division. Please understand, when I'm saying division, I am not giving it a negative tone. I'm not trying to glorify it. Like, yes, you should go march in the street today, and you should go find somebody to oppose. You are you, and so whatever you feel needs to be supported and or opposed, then yes, go do that as a citizen. But I do, and again, generally want you to understand that the idea that there are people, whether you think they're good people with a good heart, or whether you've already gone ahead and castigated them as evil and othered them, those other people, regardless, that this is common to our narrative. I don't know that it's common to other nations' narrative. It may be, but certainly in our narrative, this is a common theme. So here we are at the governance, and you can see that they are not trying to have even a unity. The idea of having a unity was really limited, and that shows up in what they wrote. They wrote articles of confederation, which for the smart ones in the room, you kind of go, wait, is that what was happening in 6061? Yes, precisely. They're linking it back to our first government. They weren't creating some weird, random other government in 1861. They were trying to say to their peer citizens, we're returning to the original government. Now, with a flaw that I at least deeply oppose, that of supporting slavery. But nonetheless, what are they doing in 1861? They're reflecting back to that. And what is this thing? Well, they're basing it on Locke. This is a short slide. Usually I have 2 or 3. I'm just give you the one. Humans are good. Humans have rights. Because they're good and they have rights and they're equal, we then do not need a government of strength. So this is that point here, right? Absolutism is condemned. Government is us. And the way I tell my students is you can constantly be thinking this question, which would be useful for you today, I think, as a citizen of this state or any state. Do you perceive government as us, or do you perceive government as them? The founders wanted it to be us. We the people, that's the Constitution, but the articles are in the same vein. It's we the people, we us. If you find that you perceive government to become them, well then there's your hint, there's a huge problem. And something to talk about with your fellow citizens. But they're trying to go down that road for Locke. So then how does that get expressed? Well, in the articles. So who has the power? Well, each of those colonies that thought they were independent. They're going to join, as you can see, in a firm league of friendship. Well, that sounds nice. What does a firm league mean? Well, it certainly did not mean we'll equally pay our taxes, because they didn't. And Washington will use that to kind of point out, hey, to Jefferson, your theories and philosophies of Locke, they sound nice, but in the practical world, they don't seem to work because people did not do what they're supposed to do. Or he would often say, quippingly, Hamilton for sure said versions of this. I was at Valley Forge, and these good citizens that you say are going to support us did not at all give us the clothes we need, or the food we need, or the animals we need, or the wagons we need. And why not? Well, we'll get to Hobbes in a minute, but that's the why not. So they're setting this up. Notice how each state is respecting the independence of the other. Now, I'm not saying this is right or good or best. I'm just wanting you to see what were they setting up. And how did it go? Not very well. They couldn't pay their bills. And they had a bad reputation overseas because they couldn't pay their bills. We all know that feeling. Maybe some of us have been here, where I can't pay my bills and I'm getting debt collection letters, I'm getting phone calls, and they're generally perceiving me negatively. That was the country. And they weren't really pulling together. And as this is going, you have crisis building. New York and New Jersey almost went to war over who controlled trade on the Hudson. And there was no one to answer the question, because if each state is independent, the federal government does not speak into that, then it comes down to if they 2 of them can work it out. And they had, as of yet, failed to work it out. And they won't work it out. And the Constitution will change the game. But they were on the verge of war. And then most famously, of course, you probably know of Shays' Rebellion. Don't see Shays' Rebellion as a unique, singular moment. See it as a representative moment of the tone of the time. Most people were frustrated. Now, like today, most people that I know who are frustrated aren't marching in the street. They just put their head down and go about their business, kind of muttering to themselves of unhappiness. That's where I am. I'm not marching in the street. You can, right? Feel like go for it. But my point is, when you see most people weren't willing to go where Shays went, and Shays really is just a figurehead for a larger movement of people who had gotten to the point where they're tipped over the edge. One of the things I try to tell students and my friends and other people, we typically won't go to extreme solutions until we perceive that normal solutions no longer work. So Massachusetts, they had perceived the normal solutions under the Articles of Governance hadn't worked. And what were they unhappy with? They were unhappy with what they perceived as a government far away from them in far off Boston, making decisions about their lives without actually consulting them, about raising taxes that they perceived to be unfair, and generally making rules for life and you don't even live here. Some of you are going, that sounds really familiar. So Shays does what he does. What's interesting, I always love this part, again, because this is off topic, but a lot of times people perceive the American Revolution as a fight over taxes, a fight over economics, a fight over representation, because we know all the things that they told us, that they wrote themselves. Almost all those things that they wrote was pure propaganda, like there was Boston Massacre, only one of those words is true, and it did happen in Boston. And so they wrote propaganda, and for me, when you examine the American Revolution, it was about one thing: control. We wanted to be in self-control. Fair enough. No argument that that's good or bad. One of the leaders, of course, is John Hancock, out there leading the charge. He wanted to be in charge of the army, not Washington, eager to fight. At this moment, he's the governor of Massachusetts. So if I tell you there's a group of citizens in Massachusetts who are rebelling against over-impressive government that's imposing on their life, raising taxes without really asking, from their point of view, their permission, and I told you Hancock's the governor, would you not imagine that Hancock would be riding on his horse to join them? Instead, he issues an executive order, in essence, that says for the militia of the state of Massachusetts to capture these people and kill or slay them if necessary. So all of a sudden, when the shoe's on the other foot and he's in charge, he's not interested in all this chirping about whether or not you have power or good representation. Division in the setting. But this division does spark, as we know, kind of our journey to the Constitution. So young nationalists, they were older people, but Madison and Hamilton are young. They're on their way. They want to make a difference, and so they're going to argue the point, and they are successfully able to convince the Articles of Confederation Congress to call for a gathering, a meeting. Now, Madison would dispute this, but pull him out of the grave and be like, that's not true, don't listen to Kreisman. But it is my contention that what he and Hamilton, these others, are doing is pushing us towards Hobbes, for good or ill, right? So real quick on Hobbes, just so you have it. Again, we usually 3 or 4 slides, but we just do one. Hobbes writing 40-ish years, 30-ish years before Locke, at the time of technically the Second English Civil War. And Hobbes's point is, no, people are not naturally good. They are instead naturally focused on themselves. They're equal, and they have equal rights. And because they're equal and they have equal rights, and because they are focused on what's best for them, they will naturally have conflict. And he said the conflict will occur in these 3 areas here, which you have to kind of read him to get more of what he's talking about. But to preserve or stop that, you must have, from his point of view, he would have said all, but majority power in the central government. Yes, in his mind, that is best as a monarch, but he conceded it wasn't about monarchs. And before you get too confused and think he's the monarchist and Locke is not, Locke supported the monarchy. He just wanted the monarchy limited in power and connected to an elected parliament. But he still wanted the monarchy. So don't think of one as monarchist and the other not monarchist. They're both monarchists. But the issue is not monarchy, the issue is power. Locke, central government, very limited power. Hobbes, central government, significant to supreme power. Does that make sense for everybody? And what you can see then in Madison and Hamilton, if you're playing a video game, there's a lever here between Locke and Hobbes, and now you're playing the game, and you're going to get off pause and see what happens to your little people on the computer screen. You had it way over here by Locke, and you had near war between New York and New Jersey, open rebellion in Massachusetts, lots of complaining other places, people not paying their taxes in different states. So you're going, oh, I need to change this. There's only one direction to go. Well, They could have gone further down the road where Locke was, which ends you up in Rousseau's world, but they went the other direction. They pulled back. So whether Madison wants to admit it or not, he's asking for more of a Hobbesian setting in the Constitution. So, in that process they do. And they immediately get opposition from the rock stars of revolution. Again, it's one of the important points. Sometimes we're going to get to Federalist, Anti-Federalist, and if you watch Hamilton, which I'm going to allude to more than once here in a second, the Anti-Federalists are a bunch of stupid people, or a bunch of nobodies. These are some of the key rock stars of the revolution. And they're going to come out loudly and long arguing this is a Hobbesian move. In other words, it is a move directly away from what we fought the revolution about. So then they're going to push down that road. And you can see this right here is Mercy Otis Warren. The Otis family was one of the most important families in Massachusetts life. John Adams considered them really the first of the revolutionaries. Before his cousin Sam got going, he felt like the Otis family were fighting. And so Mercy, who was a really close friend of Abigail's, she writes this, right? Why are they wanting to take such a bold step as the annihilation of the independence and sovereignty? Wow, right? Again, not the story we're told in 5th grade, right? So what do? They meet in Philadelphia. It's clear that there's open opposition. Rhode Island says, no, we're not playing this game. George Washington will become the president of a nation of 11 states, not 13. Because Rhode Island not only will not send anybody, as I'm about to show you in a second, they'll not support the new Constitution. And they only came in, quite honestly, after the United States threatened them with physical war and began an open economic war against the Rhode Islanders. Now that's not to say that everybody in Rhode Island was opposed. That's part of another one of the issues. It's not as if everybody in one spot feels one way. Back to my earlier slide. The human as a species simply never does that. So in every spot, you have people of a variety of kind of viewpoints and situations and settings. So Madison puts the whole thing in secret, which of course further inflamed his opponents, because if you're doing something in secret, it must be bad. You must be cheating in some way. Madison conveniently and successfully on his part uses Washington as a shield because it's hard to throw the traitor word up against the famous general. So he's able to kind of forestall that, and they go through their process, and they successfully write a document, but a document that is heavily, heavily compromised. Let me see it differently. A document that is written heavily on compromise. The other way was wrong. Don't forget that, I said that part. It's written in a way that demonstrates the tensions in the room, again in Philadelphia, and the alert to the fact that we're moving away from the Lockean articles. So to get there, even in the room, they had to compromise. They argued. They divided. And if you were here when I did the Constitution, you know there's the moment at the very end when Ben Franklin has a letter. He's so old, he can't even read it out loud himself, and he has to read a letter in which the central point of his charge to everybody in the room is, if we can't pull together in here, this will never pass out there. And most everybody in the room at that point, because a lot of people had come and left. North Carolina had to resend an entire new group of representatives because everybody who went basically aligned themselves with Rhode Island, and they're like, yeah, we're not doing this, and they left. And others did as well. So at this point, Franklin's talking to largely 100% supporters of the Constitution. In the room, there were about 5 or 6 who did refuse to sign. But he's saying to us, look, we're in the room and we already are on the same page, but we're grumbling because there's a bunch of compromises. And of course, a good compromise leaves both parties unhappy because you didn't get everything. And so he's like, we got to be unified going out of here. So you can see then this split. And this is like a little cutesy way I show my students drawing on the board, and I'm doing it here for you in the slides. So you have your happy revolutionaries, your patriots. If you go back up on the wall, if I was drawing it for you, there'd be another split before that with the loyalists on one side and the patriots on the other. And if you go back up to that, there's 13 lines, because every colony perceived themselves independently of the other colonies. Okay? Okay, you can see it in your head. So you have two groups, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And it's important for you to lock in on the Federalists because we're going to need to be able to be smart enough to handle two definitions at once. We've all read Webster's. We know there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is the first definition of the term Federalist, someone who supports the Constitution. It's crucial to, in my mind, to make sure that I acknowledge that both of these groups perceive themselves as doing good. I just think this is vital in my own personal experience with dealing with humans. I've been been fortunate to be in charge of more than one thing. And sometimes I'm shocked, totally shocked, that the people in my charge don't agree with me. I mean, my ideas are wonderful. I mean, I am so smart. I am. Occasionally I'll check in with my wife, who's smarter than I am, and we agree, so we tell everybody this is wonderful. And then some of them just disagree. Shocking. Nobody, in my experience, who disagrees with you is doing it because they're hateful, horrible people who are just trying to ruin everything you believe in. To the contrary, they have come to a different definition of what it means to work towards something good. Now that's challenging. It's very challenging. But that's a key part. Both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists perceive themselves looking back over the previous decade and saying, we're trying this experiment, and I stress for you, please lock in and grab a hold of how rare and weird it is what we were trying to do. It's such an anomaly, what we were trying to do. And I would say still trying to do. But what we were trying to do, such an anomaly. So they'd only do it for 10 years, and they're like, we gotta fix this, we gotta save this. And both perceive the other as being hurtful, but both perceive themselves as being helpful, on the right path. So as you know, we talked about it before, ratification, very close call. Rhode Island's a big fat no. North Carolina's a big fat no. Others are huge yeses, overwhelming yeses. And then there's some of the ones that are in the middle, and they're close. You can see some of the votes up there. Even though Virginia and New York technically voted after the decision was made, because it was Virginia and New York, they were vital to whether we go forward or not go forward. So their votes are important for us. And in both cases, you can see very, very close in the process. So this takes us to Joe Ellis's book and maybe the core of what we want to spend the rest of our time on. You now have a moment in which the Federalists, who are the Federalists? The people who support the Constitution. You can see them here, several of them. Right? These are all the Federalists. They are supreme. They've won. The Anti-Federalists lose. And the Anti-Federalists don't go away like the Loyalists. The Loyalists often, they basically left. And when you study this history of this large 500-ish year pattern that Strauss and Howe have written so eloquently about, that's one of the key things, is what happens after it's concluded. Different conversation. In 1776, the Loyalists all left, were basically forced out. Some stayed and learned to keep their head down and keep their mouth quiet. But here, the Anti-Federalists are too large to just leave. But you typically don't see them involved in leadership of government. Go back to the slide with those rock stars of the revolution. Those people are never in government ever again, because they're on the losing side. And so the country kind of comes behind them. We have a new document, new government, let's go forward. We're ready to go. Now, some of the Anti-Federalists, James Monroe is a very famous one for this, he ran against Madison in the first election for Congress. And he ran as an Anti-Federalist because Madison, you're trying to get Hobbes. And he barely lost. And then later, he decided it would be politically savvy for him to change his tone. So he does. So, over the Washington and Adams administration, the following list of things you see become the multiple flashpoints that drive division between the Federalists. So the Anti-Federalists are out. It's just the Federalists. Who's in the Washingtonian world? 100% we support the Constitution. We're with the president. Let's go forward. We're going to do this new thing. Within a year, cracks had emerged, and by the time we get to 1800, complete division, deep hatreds, deep animosities between people who had previously been friends at one point. Again, does that sound familiar? How was your Thanksgiving? Mine was great, but over the past couple of years, I've heard of several people that the holidays have not been happy for them. So we're going to go over all these. Let's dive in. You know this story. If you've seen Hamilton at all, you know this story. I love anything that highlights history, whether it's plays or movies, and none of them are ever perfect unless you're watching a documentary, and then a good historian could pick out flaws. I don't agree with that, as many historians would disagree with some of the things I present. But it does a good job. Hamilton is the first Secretary of the Treasury. As I already told you, our economy's not that bad off, but our overall economic standing as a nation is in trouble. And so he's got to fix it. And so at the end of the first year, he's directed by Congress, prepare a report. And he does it in a mere weeks, and it's several hundreds of pages long, which shows, again, Hamilton's mind and his scope. And in it, he comes out with a plan that we call the assumption of state debts. And what it is because, remember, all the 13 colonies, then states, were independent. They each had left the Revolution owing money to creditors, some in Europe, some here. And different things had happened. And Hamilton had the insight, if we could loop all that together into one group, it would still be debt, but then all these rich people who basically were owed money would now find it in their best interest to be supportive of the new country. Like, you don't want the country to fail because we're the ones who owe you money. And therefore, most of them, even the ones in Europe, would then see it in their own best interest to help or to be supportive. He assumed that Madison would help him because in the Federalist Papers, it's Madison who talks about the idea of assumption being a good idea. He assumes wrong, as you may know. And so in this process, we get to Jefferson. Jefferson will be tasked to be the new Secretary of State. He'd been in Paris. He'd been there during the Revolution. He'd seen the early days when the Revolution in France was kind of nice. If you were here last year, we did the early part of the Revolution. It doesn't stay nice. Later this year, we're going to do the latter part of the Revolution, and it gets really ugly, which we're about to see in this story. But he comes home, and when he comes home, he is loosely, we would say, unhappy. And his unhappiness is tinged into his perception of where the new government has gone. Now, he was supportive of the Constitution. You can see it, but it's sort of a mixed support, right? I mean, he's sort of happy, sort of not happy. And he's like, I want 9 to pass it, but then I want 4 to reject it. And that way the signal will get out that you got more to fix. His main unhappiness, we've talked about this before, was the lack of a Bill of Rights. But he was also very unhappy that there was a chief executive. I mean, we're about to cut off the heads of the guy who's the chief executive in France and not replace him for a few years. But nonetheless, we don't want one of those here, so he's not sure he likes the idea. And you can see his Lockean bona fides, right? I am not a friend to a very energetic government. Later, one of his famous statements is, a good government is one that governs the least. If Jefferson were to come out of the ground today, and just on pure civics alone and governance, he would be horrified to see what our government, and that's the government of Biden, Trump, Obama, Bush, all the way back, at least back to the 19th century. So we're not blaming any political party or person that you know of today. And the why is because of how much. Now, I would suggest we could pull Tom aside and say, hey, well, let me give you a history lesson of where we've gone through the 20th century, that there's some things and factors that play a role. But in any case, don't like an energetic. Energetic meaning the government should never do things except maybe fight a war. Maybe that's it. Should the government build a road? No, I don't think so. In essence, the government doesn't, you basically only see the government if you went to the post office. Like the idea that the government forces you to take property you own and register it with them, and then beyond that, get a photo ID document to say you can use the thing you bought. Talking about cars. He would be horrified. I kind of like the fact that you're registered, and I like the fact we have to have insurance. In the Lockean world, you wouldn't have insurance because you're a good person, and if you hit me, you'll pay for it without me asking. I'm so sorry. Here's the money for this. I'll fix it. And if you're going, that wouldn't happen, then you're not a Lockean either. So he comes back, and Madison start hanging out. They're buddies. And to a large degree, Madison worships the ground Jefferson walks on. And so in his really just first few months with Jefferson, Madison largely moves to abandon almost all of his Federalist positions. Now again, at this point, there's no political parties. There's just who's around. Who are these people? The Federalists. Who are they? First definition, the folks who support the Constitution. If you support the Constitution, you're Federalist. Everybody got that? But now you can begin to see Jefferson's not so sure. So this leads to the moment where Jefferson's like, well, I'm going to need to help Hamilton.
Two Virginians and an immigrant walk into a room diametrically opposed. foes. They emerged with a compromise, having opened doors.
So part of why I love that song is because we only know about this as a supposed compromise because Jefferson told us. And since Jefferson is almost always a liar, it's hard to really tell where he kind of sits. Oh, some of you don't, you've not been here with me before. So I'm not Team Jefferson. Jefferson's not, he doesn't always lie, but he certainly always tells a story he wants you to hear about how wonderful he is. So there is a compromise. It does end when the Residence Act is passed and the Capitol, which is one of the issues on that list, was assigned to Virginia, which going in had been really one of the last places because it was basically a swamp. And so why would he want to move there? And you know, the leading places were New York and Philly and a couple other spots. And then weeks later, within days, Madison changes his support, brings his team around, and the Assumption Act passes. So then historians ever since, like, why did that happen? And the one evidence we have is Jefferson's report, which the guys at Hamilton did a good job of kind of pointing that out. Okay? So again, it seems like they probably did have a meeting. It does seem that that's logical. And it is logical because Jefferson had been in Europe. He knew how bad our financial situation was. So for him kind of deciding that I'm going to join in with that is fine. He was, however, not happy with where things went next, in particular when Ben Franklin brought forth an anti-slavery abolition move for the country. And so, again, all I'm pointing out to you is not one thread of one person's story like Jefferson or Madison or Hamilton's, but one thread of a story of how we end up being so divided with each other, even at the very beginning, when seemingly we're all on the same team, Federalists supporting the new Constitution. Franklin had himself owned slaves early, but had to some degree obviously repented of that, moved his position around, shifted over, and had become actually the leading voice of really the world's first, or we might say one of the first, although I'll still think we were the first, abolition societies. And so he puts it forward, and because it's Franklin, they can't ignore it. And this throws all of Congress into a tizzy, because we don't want to have this conversation because of its kind of blatant example of our hypocrisy connected to the Declaration. And so they don't want to have that conversation, but they can't avoid it because it's Franklin. So they're forced to churn on it. One of the things that kind of comes out in March is that Congress declares that they just won't speak about it till 1808. And then later they'll pass what was called the gag order, which said no one is allowed to bring even up the issue of slavery. And this will be true all the way through until you get to the 1840s, when a new group of people will start being elected who don't care about paying fines and being punished for their opposition to the current viewpoint, the abolitionists who will be met, but we're going to meet them later as we go along. So, sorry this slide wasn't up when I was going before. But so now again, the big takeaway here for the Jeffersonians, and so there's now beginning to be this group who are behind Jefferson, who are thinking he's fighting the noble fight as the lone person in the cabinet against Washington and the group of Hamilton's, in other words, Hamilton's leading this direction of a certain way of empowering the federal government, and now look, they're talking about property. This is bad for us. And then, of course, not all, but many of the Jeffersonians would have owned slavery, and not all, although at this point, remember, slavery is still alive and well in all 13 states. You start having some states move to manumission after the Constitution is passed. In the 1790s, they start making that move, but you're not really, you can look at the, my mind's totally blank, in 1790, the census, and there's slaves in every one of the states in the 1790 census. Okay. Hamilton makes his next move, National Bank. Everywhere that he can see strong economic systems, particularly England, have a governing system that can run it for everybody, for the whole nation, the Bank of England. And so he's like, we should do that. This, for Jefferson, is a step too far in the process. And it begins to raise one of the tensions in the Constitution that will further cause divide over how are we to read the Constitution in its framing for us, we might say. And this is what we call loose or strict construction. Sometimes use different words these days, but it still goes loose and strict construction. What does that mean? Strict construction means, and particularly when you tie in the 10th Amendment, means that the government can only do the things that are specifically stated in the Constitution. So you can think of any of the issues in the past. I'll go away from anything overly intense. And the Congress is talking about making laws relative to AI. Well, that's not in the Constitution. Sorry. And so strict construction would say you can't have that conversation because it's not in the Constitution. Does that make sense? Loose construction, going off particularly the necessary and proper clause, Article 1, Section 8, says no. The government can do anything it wants unless it is specifically prohibited in the document. So does the document say we can't have a law about AI? Well, no. So then Congress could say it's necessary and proper in the year 2024 for us to deal with the technology that was not even known in the 1790s. And hopefully all of you go, yes, yes it is. But that's the point. So if you find yourself saying, yes it is, then later don't get mad when Congress wants to do something that you deeply disagree with and then somehow try to claim that, well, they don't have the right to do that. Because you already said you were open for necessary and proper. Can you see how from Jefferson's point of view, loose construction empowers the government to do things? And from Jefferson and now Madison's point of view, they wanted strict construction that constrained them. I will note that we won't really look at it. That's what they thought until they became the president. The moment they became the president, then they were like, oh, I think I kind of like being have a little wiggle room. I need a little wiggle room. And we're glad Jefferson changed his mind because that's how we got Louisiana. The whole Louisiana Purchase was him adopting loose construction. He wouldn't admit it, but that's the deal. And most of us were like, yeah, that was a good deal. That was a good land move. Way to go. Glad you did it. So the bank bill passes, goes before Washington, and I don't have the Hamilton music for this, and sorry it was a little too loud I guess for the speakers, but if you know the rap debate between Jefferson and Hamilton in the Hamilton story, or just generally, they have this conversation in front of Washington to say, hey, here's why this is legal, here's why it's not legal. Washington sides with Hamilton. And so they win the day, and in the process, Jefferson gets further unhappy and begins contemplating leaving the government, and around Jefferson, anti-government, anti-Washington groups begin kind of emerging around him. Those groups begin to explode in places. So just like with Shays' Rebellion, we start having other rebellions from 1791 when the bills first passed through 1794 in various places, but most famously in the western part of Pennsylvania, so basically near Pittsburgh. You have people who made whiskey for a living, and they did not like the tax that was passed. Again, the exact same complaint Shays and his crowd made, and the exact same complaint made about the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. You guys have passed a tax that we don't like. And we'll kind of claim there's no representation, but of course we know we're lying, there was representation. We just don't agree or like the representation. And this is part of Washington's argument, like you had representatives. And the whiskey people and the people in West Pennsylvania, yeah, one or two. They can't really adequately support us. So again, you get the same sense of this annoyance and this willingness to rebel. Eventually in 1794, Washington will not only call the militia, he will lead them. It's the only time, I'm pretty sure it's the only time, I think I got this right. It's the only time our chief executive and commander-in-chief of the military actually acted like the commander-in-chief by riding into battle. And right at his side, Alexander Hamilton. So they go riding over there. Most of the rebellers flee, understandably. Some people who do get captured, tried, convicted. There were several, like 10 or so, that were sentenced to be hanged or jailed, basically. Washington pardons them all in a very savvy political move, but basically made his point, who has the power? The federal government has the power. Don't mess with us. Now, this takes us to the French Revolution. The French Revolution will put enormous pressure on our government as we're making our way through the next 10 years, up basically until the War of 1812, which is an aspect of the French Revolution. In fact, we have this war. So on that list that I showed you before, there's domestic issues, there's international issues. The international issues are exclusively a product of the French Revolution. So the French Revolution, as you know, goes through a variety of governments post-beheading of the king. They can't ever really get a sense of themselves, and they struggle. But at the moment that this time period is going, they send a new ambassador, Edmund Genet. Genet comes with secret orders. Get rid of Washington. Hopefully do it nicely. Don't we're not trying to have you lead a revolutionary army against the president, but we got to get rid of him. And how can we do that? We're going to apply the exact same kinds of pressures that we applied in France, appealing to the revolutionary fervor of the Americans, helping them get into actual military battle on our side. Genet funded a bunch of ships at Washington, said couldn't happen because his argument with England was, hey, look, we're not involved in this. Don't include us in this process. And that, of course, all leads then to his decision of we've got to figure out a way to kind of stop this guy. So the way he'll do it is he will issue a proclamation of neutrality. Now this overly offends Jefferson. This is really the thing that throws him over the top. Because in Jefferson's mind, France stood with us, France participated with us, and we had an alliance with France. Washington's counter-argument was we had an alliance with a nation that was led by Louis XVI. That dude got his head cut off, so we don't know these people. To Jefferson, that's an empty argument. And so you can see the lines really drawing in at this point. He will bring it before his cabinet. Jefferson, and I think Jefferson alone, will argue for the French that we should not do this. In other words, what they wanted was us to declare war on England. We hate England. England's our enemy. We all know that. They're not our friends. They won't be our friends until the 20th century. And so we hate these guys. Let's go for it. And Washington's point is look, we cannot handle a war. And we certainly can't handle a war between the two superpowers. And he said in 92, maybe if we can go 20 years without a war, maybe we should have enough people at that point that we could sort of stand on our own. 1792 plus 20, 1812. And if you study the War of 1812, we barely made it through by the little hair of our chinny chin chin. I mean, it was a close run thing. And what happened in 1814 and 15. So Washington was right, but just barely. He's we can't get involved in this. Jefferson was incensed. And so now you get a political party coming around Jefferson, and they will begin to call themselves Republicans because they perceive themselves supporting the Republic. Now Jefferson, to his credit, I don't give credit to Jefferson for much. Jefferson, to his credit, did hold off Genet, and when Genet openly kind of put in front of him, let's overthrow Washington, and I'll put you as the president, Jefferson sort of kicked him out of his office, said, no, not having this conversation, and then went and told Washington of the conversation. So at least Jefferson at that point had some decent pro-USA, pro-Washington aspects. But you can see his influence. There were papers in New York, which is where the capital was at this point, asking for guillotines to be set up. Now they weren't saying let's use them. It was sort of like a message to Washington. You know what happens? So you can see the influence of where Genet's going and how this is deepening the tension in the process. Then Genet makes his next move, which is really critical. Genet wants to build support for his viewpoint, particularly his viewpoint of getting rid of Washington. He knows an election is going to come again. They don't know at this point that Washington will step down for the 96 election. And he's thinking maybe we can make a difference. So Genet sets up the equivalent of the Jacobin groups who had been set up in France. So that whole story about France is that there's a lot of groups who begin meeting, citizens begin talking, they don't really have an agency to do so, and they weren't all on this club, but they joined this club. Then this club becomes really the dominant power in the march the French go on in their revolution, and they become kind of famous, or some people infamous, about some of the choices they did. Well, now Genet knows that name will not fly. That's a French name for a French purpose with French context. So I need another name. Well, what am I trying to argue? Well, I'm trying to argue that your country should move more towards a democracy, because you're not one now. Everybody knows that, hence the second name. You're a republic. But you really should be moving towards a democracy, because remember, in a democracy, all the citizens vote on all the issues all the time. And so Genet's arguing that more people support me than you, Washington. They support France, not England. If we put this bad boy to a vote, I will win. So he's working to build support for this. These societies become cheap in their support behind Jefferson. However, I hasten to say to you, never, ever, ever call Jefferson's political party the Democrat Republicans, not only because it's not true, but because it undercuts what happens under President Jackson in 1824-28. So you need to save that for 24, 28 when it really does happen, and there actually is a political party called the Democrat Republicans. So the Republicans are supported by these societies, these kind of, we would call it a political action committee. We know what those are like. So that's what they're doing. These guys are going to be the ones who really help inflame the Whiskey Rebellion before Washington goes out in '94 and puts it down. We're almost through Washington. He's still worried, though, because the chief superpower is England. There are still troops on our shores, on our soils. They've not left some of the forts they were supposed to have left. Some of the decisions made in the original peace agreement in Paris had not been followed through. Again, remind yourself, we're the super tiny, insignificant country. I'm not trying to be dismissive to some country, but today, a small country like El Salvador or Sierra Leone, wonderful people in these places, but nobody cares what they think. Like, nobody, at the UN level, nobody's listening to them. Maybe they should, but they're not. That was the United States. So we're small, we're insignificant, we got great potential. We've got the whole half of the continent to the Mississippi River, and more people are coming all the time, hence Washington's 20-year thing. However, nobody cares what we think. We cannot get into a war with either of the superpowers. And so he decides to send the sitting Chief Justice, John Jay, which tells you the Supreme Court had nothing to do, send them off to London. So he sent them off to London because he had been there in the original alliance. They liked him there. Go get something worked out. He does. It is not a good treaty for us. It's a treaty you would expect between a superpower and an insignificant power. And so Great Britain is able to kind of tell us, this is what's happening, this is what you're doing, this is what we will agree to, and then maybe we'll leave you alone. And he comes back with the treaty. When Washington reads it, he knows he's in trouble. Part of why Washington's like, I'm not even going to run in '96. This is ridiculous. It was deeply opposed. Even some Federalists were unhappy because, wow, this isn't good. Why'd you do this? But he was trying to call England off and lower the tension. By the way, this is an example of how you can know Washington wasn't of either political party, because he didn't do what would be in his best interest politically right here on this move, which would have been to declare war on England. Because he's from Virginia, he's more naturally, seemingly, to be a Republican. It would have been a great move for him to kind of pull that off. So he does that. Now, at this point, you now have your political parties. Both parties are in the open. Hamilton has come out very clearly. Now, so this leads us to, again, you're all intelligent, I know you can do this, to the second definition of the Federalist. So now the Federalist of the second definition is what? Hamilton's political party. So then on our board, on our slide, I'll come back to this. You have Federalists over here, Republicans over here. Here are the Founding Brothers. Who are these? These are all the Federalists. Who are all the Federalists? Thomas Jefferson's a Federalist. Till you get down here, then he's not a Federalist because he's the leader of the political party, the Republicans. Does that make sense for everybody? Can you all see that kind of a thing? Again, neither founder will see himself to start a political party. Both founders will think the other guy's evil and that started a political party. And if you pay attention, and if you read Washington's farewell address, or you literally read almost anything Adams writes, the last two of our founders who were saying, no, I will not be in a political party. Both men will go to their graves. It's not part of a political party. And I know if you Google it, you'll get different information. They're wrong. The evidence is not on their side, the people who say that way. They are Federalists of the first definition, not the second definition. And they'll try to argue it off. Some would argue that, again, because of the nature of the human, and particularly the way our Constitution is written to kind of give a one side versus the other side tension in those compromises, lends itself to us having, as you know, significantly, almost always only two parties. It's a different conversation, but just pointing that out to you. So here that is, and now we move into this. What are the party differences? We're not going to spend a lot of time here because we've done this when we looked at the history of political parties. And by the way, I've mentioned more than once different talks. You can find all those on my YouTube channel if you want to go look. And if you don't know, I'll show you my email at the end. You can email me and say, can you send me the link for that one about political parties? Or can you send me the link about that one about 1776? And I'll definitely show them to you. But generally, you can see the Federalists are staying on the Hobbesian side, as well as some geographic stuff and economic stuff that's here. The Republicans, much more on the Lockean side. That's why wealth is land. Wealth is not money. You know, it's the idea, if I could offer you $5 million today and I give it to you in cash or in land, the smart ones of you would take the land. Everybody under the age of 40 take the cash. Maybe everybody under the age of 60 would take the cash, because they perceive the cash as being wealth. And the founders would go, you just took a whole bunch of paper. Why would you take a bunch of paper when you could have gotten the land? All right? So maybe more you want to ask me about, you can ask me, again, any question at the end. Washington says, I'm not doing this anymore. He steps down. There's no rule against him running for a third time. He would have won. But he says, I'm not doing this. I step down. Who does that leave us with? Adams and Jefferson. Now, Adams had largely been shut out of key aspects of the government at this point. He'd done his job as vice president, and he's the first vice president of many to talk about what an insignificant system it is. Vice president basically doesn't have a role. Okay. So he had maintained his friendship with Jefferson. And again, Jefferson, who's very duplicitous, was able to give one image to Adams with a different image totally to Madison or to Hamilton. So Adams doesn't realize Jefferson really is. If you'd ask Adams, who leads these two political parties? He said Hamilton and Madison, not his friend Tom. He'll find out he's wrong. In the win, he'll pull it out, and he actually does turn to Jefferson in one of the most poignant moments, I would say disastrous moments, probably the last moment we could have moved our government away from the political parties and their influence. You would never have eliminated political parties. When you read the farewell address, Washington's not suggesting there's a way to eliminate political parties. What Washington and the founders believed was that there was a class of leaders who could rise above that and who would lead only from what was best for the total and not be linked to a political party. They would have said, not only if someone tells you they should be the president, that's the last person to vote for, but if you know someone has close alignment with the political party, never vote for that person. Well, you and I know that's not our system. That's not who we are. And this is that's why I get really frustrated with Jefferson, some of you know, because he betrays Adams here. And this was the last moment which we could have. I don't know that it would have worked, but we could have forestalled or limited the influence of the parties and maybe called out leaders to move away from the parties, to rise into just kind of this leadership role where they care for the whole, not the group. That's a tough call for the human as a species, and since I'm a human and I've been a leader, I know how hard it is. It's easier to be aligned with a faction. It just is. So anyway, Madison says, don't do that. That won't work. And so we go into Adams' time kind of confronting this I'm sorry this thing is all moving all over my face. Continuing to confront what's happening with the French Revolution. So Adams will learn the hard truth, and Adams will find himself trapped, basically. Remember, Washington's the first president. So as we know, he walked on untrodden ground, meaning everything he did, and he recognized this would be viewed. Well, Adams is the next president. What do you do? If Mr. Biden wins in 24, he'll probably replace half his cabinet. Because we just know that's the system that we have, and he's not paying people off, but he's helping them out, people who helped him, just like that kind of stuff. And obviously, if Mr. Trump wins, and then if Mr. Biden wins in 28, if a new Democrat wins, they won't keep Mr. Biden's cabinet. They'll replace it all with their friends, people who are closely aligned to them, which we understand all that, right? Adams doesn't know that. So he keeps Washington's cabinet. But what he doesn't know is that they're actually all loyal to Hamilton, and through Hamilton to Washington. So he basically gets himself trapped where he has nobody to advise him except for Abigail and John Quincy. So he'll really be an isolated man. So again, when you study the Adams for years, you really can get a picture of what would it be like in our current day were someone to run independent and win. It'd be very, very difficult for that person. Not saying not to vote third party or for independence. That's pretty much who I vote for all the time. But just saying that you have to acknowledge in a system in which everybody's linked to one of two groups, if you're this independent person, it's very, very difficult to pull that off. And Adams' 4 years is an example of that. Well, what happened in his 4 years? One, we just see an open drift to war. The English and the French are going to press on in. Napoleon's not here yet, but he's coming. But they're already on the verge of a world war between each other. And in that process, Adams, who again is often, people would say, oh, he's a Federalist, will show that he's not. Because if he was a Federalist, he would love to have a war with France. Instead, he sends a peace delegation off to France. When they get there, the secretary, the ambassador, the leader of the state for France as far as diplomacy goes, is a man named Talleyrand. He'd actually been around back before the revolution began. And so you can see how wily and political he is. They need to meet him They're not allowed. They're met by several other people, 4, 5, 6 different people, and they all say basically, before you meet with Mr. Talleyrand, you have to pay us a bribe. And they're like, yeah, we're not doing that. But again, you can sort of see powerful country, weak, insignificant country. So they stand their ground, they say, nope, not doing that. And so then that gets back to us as the XYZ affair. In the XYZ affair, the dispatches of the information get back to President Adams. Here's what's going down. Some of his Federalists in the cabinet are also knowing these things, and they're eager to go to war. Hamiltonians. They're Federalists now, the political party. Adams, the last thing he wants is a war. He agrees with Washington's viewpoint. And so he's like, no. Well, Republicans in Congress thought that the rumor mill on the street was exactly that, like a rumor mill to try to make the Republicans look bad, that Adams was lying about the whole thing. So in Congress, Republicans and Federalists joined together to vote to force the president to release the dispatches from the ambassadors. So he's like, aye, but he replaces the names and put XYZ, actually there was another guy who put W, but we just like XYZ, in there to try to protect the reputation of France and really to give himself some future wiggle room to try to work it out with France. He doesn't want to cause these specific people to be, looking bad in print. Obviously the Republicans are shocked and they're like, oh shoot. And the Federalists are rejoicing. Here's their moment to strike and to go hard. So they go hard on the process. And Congress and the cabinet, which remember is loyal to Hamilton, will come out and begin pushing for war. Now, war does break out. So one of the, again, things we're not told is that there was a war before the XYZ affair. There was the quasi-war. And then if you pay attention, there's the war with the Barbary pirates in Adams' first term. We only call the War of 1812 the first war because we voted to go to war. But as you know, since 1945, we've been at war every day since, and we've not declared a war, so apparently we're cool with that. And so the quasi-war is our first next war. And in this war, it's all fought at the high seas, which means Federalist calls for an army make no sense whatsoever. Now, how is France supposed to get an army over here? If it's England, they're in Canada already. So it seems clear to many, and Adams was one of these people. Remember, at this point, Adams hates, capital H, hates Alexander Hamilton. We get another piece of evidence. He's not part of the Federalist Party, Adams. And it seems likely, and Hamilton had let some casual conversation slip about this amongst people, that he wanted to take command of an army of 50,000 troops and march his little tail down to Virginia and kind of get some political payback on some things. Now, we don't want to press that too far. Hamilton does not go as far as Burr, where Burr will go when he was wanting an army and seemingly openly about trying to start a new country out in the West Country. Hamilton is not saying that, but it does seem likely that he wants to use the army for political pressure of some type. Even if that's not true, clearly you and I can see there's zero reason for an army. The whole point of the Second Amendment and the whole point of the Constitution did not set up an army was in keeping with our viewpoint that it would be the militia and the citizens who fought when needed. So let the French land an army, we'll deal with it then. That would be Adams' position. However, Adams, who's really the father of the United States Navy, he's technically the father of the United States Army, that's a different conversation. The father of the United States Navy will push for Congress to fund and support new line of frigates, which they will eventually build some of them as we go along in the process. And you can see the rest of what Congress does here, including nullifying the alliance. So Congress is doubling down. Now, at this moment, had there been the next presidential election, Adams wins in a landslide. However, not the moment, 2 more years to go. So Congress, thinking itself so powerful, begins to say, we need to shut down all the chirping from Jefferson and the Republicans. So they pass a series of 4 bills in Congress that today we loop together and call the Alien and Sedition Acts. And in the Alien and Sedition Acts, they basically, short version, set up rules that would allow them to go after new French immigrants who had showed up, who maybe were there for nefarious purposes, at least from the viewpoint of the Federalists, and go after anybody who would print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, or malicious writing about the government. Now, this is a stain on Adams' presidency because we would have preferred he vetoed this. But remember, at this point, he feels completely hemmed in by the Federalist Party on one side and the Republican Party on the other side. Had he vetoed it, they would have overridden the veto. But still, we would prefer to see him stand up on some stance and go, no, that isn't necessary. But put Adams in with Woodrow Wilson, with FDR, with Polk, with Abraham Lincoln, and almost every time we've gone to war, our presidents have pressed beyond the Constitution, usually with congressional support, relative to issues about rights, often about free speech. I mean, at least Adams wasn't putting French people in concentration camps or armed, guarded with barbed wire and guns like FDR did with Japanese American citizens. So it's a common theme, whether I like the theme or not, that I can see in American history. And the reason they did it was because they perceived themselves to be in a kind of a vulnerable moment in which the last thing we need is somebody writing things that may or may not have been true in the process. And there was, to be fair, some writings that were just making stuff up. Our modern day views about expectations of journalism did not exist at that time. So you could print something. The print of that time is like the social media of this time. Now you and I can write whatever we want to write about anybody we want to write, and we can say horrible things, and now with technology we can do terrible, terrible things like deep fakes, etc. And nobody can come to stop us. And we'll claim it's free speech. And that's the journalism of that time. So, Madison and Jefferson have to act. Well, Jefferson's decided he has to act. So he's a Monticello at this point. And he's basically seeing himself with the new state of Kentucky, kind of helping them out. So he writes a series of resolutions. He tells Madison about them, and at some point Madison comes to visit him. When Madison comes to visit him, he shows them to them. Jefferson's language, as is typical for him, often fiery, impulsive, passionate. In Jefferson's resolutions, he starts off, or he gets to a place where, because what we set up was this compact or this agreement amongst states with autonomy, if the federal government passes a law that you don't like as a state, you can just flat out nullify it. Then he pressed on to say a version of it, doesn't use the S word, but a version of that state could basically leave the country if it wants to. He's the first one to give some sort of definition and defense to the concept of secession. Now when Madison reads this, Madison's like, whoa, 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 a little too far there, brother. And he talks him off the ledge. The resolutions that eventually go to Kentucky not only are modified somewhat by the Kentuckians, but Jefferson himself backs off and takes that little bit out. Madison takes a copy, goes home to Montpelier, and begins writing to do the same thing. And the decision's made, we'll try to get these passed by both state houses to be published basically in a defense of liberty. So they do. Madison's are far more measured. Remember, next to Adams, Madison is the greatest constitutional mind of the age. So he's thinking in a constitutional way, kind of a legal mind, looking for measured language, to be careful in his language. He avoids all the passionate rhetoric of Jefferson and argues similarly that if pressed, a state could nullify the law. Madison really is the first to openly argue that we're talking and understanding the Constitution of it being a compact between autonomous units. Now this will really come to play in the 1830 blow-up with Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun in South Carolina moving to nullify the law, the tariff law of 29, but it blows up in 1830. And John C. Calhoun will then become the chief voice of the compact theory. The compact theory is precisely what the South Carolinians in 1860, and then all the states, including the Floridians, in December and January of 1860, joining them in a new confederation, will argue. It was a compact. It's no different than we can say, you made a compact today. You came here. But none of you, you'd be horrified, and you'd probably call 911 if I or the library staff prohibited you from leaving. You would say, I'm an autonomous being. I chose to come. I've joined in this little cabal, but now I don't like what I'm hearing, and I'm choosing to leave. That's the compact theory of the Constitution. It does not have, don't link it to the Southerners in 1860. Link it to Jefferson and to the early part of the conversation of what have we set up in our country. Now, ultimately, these will get passed. Kentucky will pass theirs in early December, Virginia in later December. There's that compact between the states. The response is not what they wanted. 7 of the 16 states, so 7 of the remaining 14, wrote back and kind of voted and published their own opposition to this concept. So again, you can see, I don't think it's 7-2. I don't think it's also fair to say that it's 9-7, but you can again see within the country this deep division that has kind of come out of this conversation of what are we supposed to do in this war? The fact that the country is facing a war that people have different sides on, again, you should go, that sounds familiar. Right? So it's not a new journey for us. That then leads us to the 1800 election. So I should have put the slide up with all the lists again. So we just went through every one of those domestic and international issues. The bigger group under Washington because of his 2 terms, the latter group under Adams with his 1 term. Most of them, not Assumption, not the bank, not slavery, and not really the Whiskey Rebellion, but most of them all linked to the international pressure brought on by the French Revolution. And again, I'm not trying to say what they should or shouldn't have done, who's right or who's wrong. I'm just wanting you to get this sense of, here these guys are within 10 years of writing a constitution, winning a ratification battle against opponents who were rock stars and famous, and defeating them and shutting them down, now at each other's throats. And the coming at each other's throats come out in the 1800 election. Now Adams learns the hard truth. You can't win an election without a political party, because he will be a man without a party. In 1799, he will send a new delegation back to France to try to say, hey, we don't need to be at war. It will be successful. John Quincy told him, hey, Talleyrand's sorry. And so, because John Quincy said so, he said, we're going to send another delegation back. He ends up firing, finally, not till 1800 does he fire the Hamilton cabinet members. Well, 2 of them. The others kind of realized they should sort of shut up and take it and be on his team. But it's obviously far too late to kind of craft his own administration policy because he's really not had a cabinet to support him. So he gets rid of them and kind of moves on from there. But again, it is too late. The election actually ends up being closer than we thought. Now Hamilton, again, if you know the play, he finally releases an attack letter, puts it in the paper. It's a screed, and the person who looks unhinged, the play kind of gives you this, is Hamilton. And it is one of the key things that kind of undermines Hamilton's own kind of political future, although he's really already done that to himself with the adulterous affair and some other decisions that he's made. Adams gets some sympathy votes. Had he not released the letter, Adams would have come in 4th, because the Federalists were pretty much united behind. It's kind of hard to see. You can't really see it here. Here's the man's name, Pinckney, who comes in 4th with 64 votes. So Adams has 65. Jefferson and Burr tie with 73. And there's more about the 1800 election. That's not really our focus. The point is that we've now successfully split the gathered group. That we split the gathered group should not be, I mean, it may be something you go, I'm sad about that. Yes, but I don't want you to think that it's an aberration. It turns out that it's normal for us. Let me show you. Just for the rest of the way, all the way to 1860. I started to make another slide post-Civil War. You know those better. The populist, the Reconstruction battle. Reconstruction's a complete disaster from my point of view. That takes you to the 1870s, the populists in 1880, the progressives in 1890 into the early 1920s, the battle over World War I, the reaction negatively to World War I, the spin the other direction, then the battle over the power of the government that occurs into FDR's term. It goes away because of the war, and then many of you, like me, have lived through many of the decades after World War II, so you know all the divisive moments. My point of trying to raise it for you, again, is to see how that kind of plays a consistent drumbeat in our story. You can see it socially, you can see politically. Let's go back to my cute little slide. This is what we're going to end up with, right? So here's your founding brothers. They split. The Federalists basically disappear. You'll have a 24-year, if you ever wonder what it would be like for the country to have one political party, here's your 24-year window when it happens. And then comes Jackson. We've talked about him before in here too. Jackson accuses the government and the leaders of the government of a corrupt bargain. It's not really good evidence for that. But again, this leads then to a split of the Republicans, and eventually that will give us the Democrat Republicans under Jackson and the National Republicans under Quincy and Clay. They lose, they disappear. Within 3 or 4 years, some of them will come over here, but there'll be this open opposition that, hey, Jackson's acting like a king. Because he's acting like a king, we need a party that represents opposition to the king, so they reach over to British history, pull over the Whig Party. Eventually, we'll get this movement that I mentioned to you in the 1830s and 40s, a new abolition movement that emerges, and they will go political. And so they'll have 3 groups, the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, and eventually the Republican Party. So these 3 groups will demonstrate. This idea of constant back at each other's throats should hopefully help you realize it's a myth what we've told it. And my only point of trying to raise it to you as we're heading into, obviously, we're in tumultuous waters. And you alone can tell me when you think they started. But that, like I said, not our first rodeo. We can live through it if we remember some key concepts. And one of those concepts I would suggest is that there's a sense in which I shouldn't expect all my neighbors in Winter Park, in Orange County, in Orlando, in Florida, to have the same viewpoint as I do, which then raises the question, and I'll leave you with this, how do we work that out? Where do we find any common ground? And that's the struggle of this type of a system. But it's still, to me, a republic, the best type of system for us to work our way into. And with that, I will stop and see if you have any questions. If you may have a question you'd like to ask. It's okay if you don't. It's a beautiful day outside. Some of you may be heading down to MegaCon, being the cool kids. Or over to the park and enjoy the beautiful weather.